To understand the origins of GO ALRT, we first must understand the origins of the GO train in general and what is arguably to this day its biggest flaw. In the post-war years, Toronto, like other North American cities, was experiencing a population boom and the rapid expansion of suburbia. As development spilled out beyond the borders of metropolitan Toronto and into the surrounding municipalities, it became clear to the province of Ontario that in time the number of commuters traveling from outside Toronto into the city for work would eventually overwhelm pre-existing infrastructure such as Highway 401 and the Queen Elizabeth Expressway. Throughout the early 60s, various reports would all come back with the same answer to this problem. That answer being a commuter rail line along the Lakeshore Rail Corridor from Oakville to Pickering, known as Dunbarton at the time. The provincial government would set about this project, and on May 23, 1967, the first train for the newly created GO Transit would embark on its maiden journey from Oakville to Toronto's Union Station. A train would depart from Pickering Station in the east 10 minutes later, with both trains meeting at Union Station. Within only 4 months, the new commuter rail line had already carried 1 million passengers, with a daily ridership averaging at around 15,000 riders per day. The new Lakeshore commuter line wasn't just a success, it exceeded all expectations. But there was an issue. An issue that would eventually drive the province of Ontario to look for an alternative, an issue we still face today, albeit to a lesser degree. What is that issue, you ask? Well, it's simple. The province didn't own the tracks the trains operated on. The Lakeshore line was owned by CN Rail, meaning GO Transit had to share the line with CN's freight train traffic and was thus at the mercy of CN Rail. At the time, you could argue this wasn't much of an issue, but the province was already aware that service would inevitably need to increase as the Greater Toronto Area continued to grow, and this would inevitably bring the province and the freight companies into conflict. As the 60s became the 70s, this would become more apparent, and while GO service was expanded, there was still the issue of the freight companies owning the lines, meaning GO Transit's potential would always be limited to whatever CN Rail and CP Rail would be willing to give them. The province did examine the possibility of electrifying the pre-existing GO lines, but the high capital cost to do this still didn't solve the biggest issue. Even if the province spent the money to electrify the network and upgrade the signals for more frequent service, it still didn't change the fact that the province didn't own the rails themselves. It would be spending hundreds of millions of dollars for little benefit. The GO ALRT plan would be a reaction to this reality, with the provincial government looking for one thing in all of this: control. GO ALRT at its most fundamental level was a reaction to the fact that the province had no control over the rail lines it operated on. GO ALRT was a plan that would give the province complete control over every aspect of GO service, control over operations, the trains, the infrastructure, and the schedule. No need to share or coordinate with the other rail companies. GO ALRT would exist in its own closed ecosystem, where the province would operate and expand service as the Greater Toronto Area expanded without needing to deal with either the freight companies or via rail. Now, before we get into the exact details of the ALRT plan, it is important to mention that this idea didn't just come out of nowhere. The province did examine alternatives. As part of this process, the province set out 2 major criteria that the proposed service must meet, those being: 1. The new service must have a minimum capacity to move 16,500 passengers per hour per direction. 2. The new service must offer a level of comfort and performance equal to or greater than the service currently provided. With these requirements set out, the province would examine 6 possible technologies for expanded GO train service, those being: 1. Maintaining and expanding service with the pre-existing technology of diesel locomotives with bi-level coaches. 2. Convert service to electric locomotives with bi-level coaches. 3. Convert service to electric multiple unit operations, be they single level or bi-level. 4. Replace the network with long-distance LRT lines. 5. Replace service with the proposed ALRT cars. And 6. Replace service with a network of busways. Of these 6 options, 2 were quickly discarded. The LRT option was dropped as the vehicles were not considered suitable for high running speeds between widely spaced apart stations. As well, standing passengers were to be kept to a minimum. Busways were dropped as at the time there was no system that could safely control a large number of closely spaced together buses operating at high speed under individual drivers. As well, there was a high operating cost. This left 4 options on the table: diesel locomotives, electric multiple units, and ALRT. To further whittle down the options, the remaining 4 technologies were compared based on criteria such as quality of service, capital cost for facilities and rolling stock, annual operations and maintenance costs, general environmental impacts from construction, operations, and power consumption, operational flexibility, such as schedules, and flexibility to match passenger growth. Diesel trains would be dropped from the plan, as while they did score highly in some areas, it was noted that of the 4 remaining options, diesel trains had the highest operating costs compared to the 3 other electric options. As well, diesel trains didn't fix the issue of having to share tracks with the freight railways, meaning passengers and GO Transit would just have to accept that service would continue to be hamstrung by both CN and CP rails. EMUs were also dropped for similar reasons. While the operating costs were lower than diesel trains, it still didn't address the core issue: control over all aspects of the line's operations. This left GO ALRT and electric locomotives as the 2 remaining options, and as I have stated before, the province wanted a service that they had full control over, everything from the operations to the infrastructure. And for that reason, electric locomotives were dropped as an alternative, leaving only ALRT as the preferred option for expanded GO service. GO ALRT scored highly on all criteria, featuring a lower operating cost, lower energy consumption, and most importantly, it would give the province complete control over the service. How, you might ask? Well, why don't we finally get into some of the finer details of GO ALRT?
At a glance, GO ALRT, which stands for Government of Ontario, Advanced Light Rail Transit, is the brainchild of Premier of Ontario Bill Davis and his Minister of Transportation and Communications, James Snow. This new system would have been composed of 2 lines crossing the Greater Toronto Area, offering a rapid transit-style service. One line would follow the shore of Lake Ontario, operating between Oshawa and Hamilton, while the other line would cross the north end of Toronto, operating from Pickering to Oakville. This new service would be fast, with trains reaching a top speed of 120 kilometers per hour. This new service would be frequent, with trains operating at frequencies of up to every 2 minutes during rush hour. This new service would be reliable, with fully automated trains ensuring they keep to a schedule. The lines would also be built on their own dedicated right-of-ways, ensuring no conflict between ALRT and other rail operators. This new service would be convenient, with closer spaced stops to ensure more residents have easier access to fast and reliable public transit. And lastly, this new service would be environmentally friendly, with fully electric trains connected to overhead catenary and powered by Ontario's vast supply of hydroelectric and nuclear power. This is GO ALRT at a glance, a new fast, convenient, and reliable way for people to commute across the Greater Toronto Area.
Of course, though, it's not that simple. You didn't come to this channel for a simple explanation. You came here to spend half an hour or more looking at some of the finer details of the plan. So let's start with the trains themselves. The provincial government gives a brief summary of the cars, so I will start with that before going into more detail.
Operating on exclusive right-of-ways, the vehicles will be lightweight, air-conditioned, and electrically powered. Onboard computers would aid in providing on-schedule service using automatic train control. Constructed of lightweight aluminum, they will have comfort and seating standards equal to GO Transit bi-level cars. Wide doors will provide easy access, and large double-glazed windows will give passengers panoramic views. The vehicles will operate at speeds up to 120 kilometers per hour, and trains will run on continuously welded rail to reduce noise. CCTV on board and on station platforms will ensure passenger safety and convenience.
The trains to be used on GO ALRT lines would be a variant of the Intermediate Capacity Transportation System (ICTS) vehicles used in Vancouver and developed by the provincially owned Urban Transportation Development Corporation, or UTDC for short. Unlike the trains used in Vancouver, which are propelled via linear induction motors powered by two power rails, the ALRT trains would be more conventional using standard 600-volt DC traction motors, 4 per car, with power coming from an overhead catenary supplying 25 kilovolts of AC power. These trains, like their Vancouver variant, would be automated using the CellTrack CBTC system. The design of the trains also went through some revisions over the life of the project. The first model of the trains was the same as the trains used in Vancouver, just with conventional motors and power system. The individual cars would be 41 feet, 12.7 meters in length, and feature 2 doors per car. Cars would be linked together into 3-car trains and would feature an open gangway to allow passengers to walk between the cars. The front and rear cars would be power and motor cars, each equipped with a single-arm pantograph, while the middle car would just be a motor car. Lastly, these trains could be linked together to form longer 6-car, 9-car, and even 12-car multiple units if ridership demanded such. As stated before, the design of these trains would go through 2 revisions over their history. The first revision of the design would see the length of the cars increase to 59 feet, or 17.9 meters, and linked together in 2 car sets instead of 3. One car would be a power motor car with a single-arm pantograph, while the other would just be a motor car. Each car would also now feature 4 doors per car instead of 2. The crush capacity of a 2-car train would be 328 passengers, although the in-service capacity was lower at 166 per train, 124 of those seated. Lastly, these trains could be linked together to form longer 4-car, 6-car, 8-car, and even 10-car multiple units if necessary. This design would go through one final revision before the ALRT project was permanently shelved. This final revision would see the train cars further lengthened, now to 75 feet or 22.8 meters. Each car would now also have 6 doors per car instead of 4, making these trains similar in dimension to the trains used on the Toronto subway. These trains, like the prior revisions, would be made up of 2 cars with an open gangway for passengers. Lastly, these trains could be linked together to form 4-car and 6-car multiple units if necessary. Finally, an important feature to note is that seating on all 3 revisions would be forward and backwards facing like on the GO train today. There would be no transverse seating like on the subway. It's important to remember that while GO ALRT would operate a rapid transit style service in regards to frequency and convenience, GO ALRT would also do that while operating commuter rail style comfort. So now that we have discussed the ALRT trains, let's talk about the infrastructure the trains would have run on. There were naturally standard specifications for the route that would be followed whenever possible. While the trains could negotiate grades as steep as 5%, it was preferred that grades not exceed 3%. The radius of curves along the line should be no less than 800 meters when possible, as this was how tight a turn trains could make while operating at full speed. Grades steeper than 3% and curves tighter than 800 meters were acceptable in places where there was no other option, as both of these factors would require trains to slow down. The routes themselves would ideally be at grade, but elevated and underground alignments would be used where necessary. In the case of elevated alignments, the elevated structure would be made of prefabricated concrete segments elevated a minimum of 5 meters or 16 feet off the ground. Support columns would be spaced every 30 meters, 98 feet, with every fourth column being square to deal with torsion forces on the structure. The other columns would be cylindrical with a diameter of 1 meter to reduce visual impact. The entire vertical envelope of the elevated structure from ground level to the top of the catenary pole would be a minimum of 12 meters or 39 feet. Underground sections would be constructed using the cut and cover method in order to reduce cost and speed up construction. While underground stations would be shallow, the exact depths of the stations and tunnel would vary depending on conditions above and around the tunnel and station. On the topic of stations, ALRT stop spacing would be around every 2 to 3 kilometers. Platforms would have a length of 180 meters or 590 feet. This would be just barely long enough to fit a 10-car Revision 1 train and long enough for a 6-car Revision 2 train. As well, all platforms would be high level like the subway, with said platforms being 88 centimeters, 2 feet 9 inches, from the top of the rail. Stations would be straight and could have a maximum grade of plus or minus 0.5%, or basically flat. The exact amenities at each station would vary, but connections to local transit as well as parking lots and pickup areas where space is available would be preferred. The maximum throughput of an ALRT line was expected to be 25,000 passengers per hour. Finally, while ALRT trains could reach speeds of up to 120 km per hour, the average speed would be around 70 km an hour. This brings up an interesting discussion. With an average speed of 70 km per hour and a stop spacing of 2 to 3 km, would ALRT be a viable commuting option? The answer is yes, but not for everyone. GO ALRT wasn't really meant for people making super long journeys from, say, Pickering to Hamilton. ALRT's value was in shorter inter-regional trips like Pickering to Toronto, but also intra-regional trips. Operating at rapid transit level frequencies with rapid transit stop spacing meant that ALRT would have a similar utility to the Toronto subway. It was in essence to be a subway where there wasn't a subway. Its goal wasn't just to bring faster, more convenient service to the various parts of the Greater Toronto Area, its goal was to help integrate the various regions of the Greater Toronto Area, not just together, but within themselves as well. The various municipalities along the route could center themselves around the ALRT lines. This would in theory help alleviate congestion in downtown Toronto by shifting jobs and commuters away from it. But it would also allow someone in, say, Oshawa to easily commute to Pickering for work since trains would operate at subway level frequencies. Similarly, someone in Etobicoke could work in Mississauga and utilize the ALRT system to great effect if it was easily accessible. Accessibility was another key to the ALRT system's success, as it was necessary for the various transit agencies around the Greater Toronto Area to feed into the ALRT network. The more bus routes that could be connected to the ALRT stations, the more useful and accessible it would be to riders. This is the exact principle the TTC uses in Toronto to great effect. Every bus route in the city, barring a few exceptions, feeds riders into at least one subway station. ALRT was to be built on the same principle. Buses would connect riders to ALRT stations where trains would come every 2 minutes during rush hour and every 15 minutes off-peak. Riders would then use the ALRT line for either short local trips of a couple stops within their region or use it for longer trips into a neighboring region. With all of that out of the way, we can finally move on to a bit more of a detailed look on the individual routes. I am going to start with the proposed Northern Line, as that was the route that was proposed to be built first and of the two was the most likely to actually be built. The overall concept of the route was one that would run from Pickering in the east to Oakville in the west while serving the northern edge of Toronto. When you look at maps for the GO ALRT project, you'll usually see the Northern Line running through the Finch Hydro Corridor. And while that would become the preferred alignment of the route, it wasn't the only one the province examined. The first alternate alignment we'll look at followed highways 401 and 403 between Pickering and Oakville. The second alignment, which was called the Sheppard-Eglinton alignment, was proposed to run from Pickering Station along Ellesmere Road and north on the Stouffville GO line to Sheppard Avenue. From there, the route would then follow Sheppard Avenue to the Barrie GO line, where it would then head south to Eglinton Avenue. The route would then run along Eglinton Avenue to Renforth Road. There, the route would follow the Central Mississauga and East Border Hydro corridors to Burnhamthorpe Road. The route would then follow Burnhamthorpe Road to Trafalgar Road, where it would head south to Oakville Station. The third alignment proposed was the Sheppard alignment. This alignment was a lot like the last one, although this one would stay on Sheppard Avenue to the Humber-Pearson Hydro corridor, where it would then follow that into Mississauga following the previous alignment to Oakville Station. The final alternate alignment was the Finch Avenue alignment. Like the other two, this route would start at Pickering Station and follow Ellesmere Road to the Stouffville GO line. From there, it would travel north to Finch Avenue. The route would then follow Finch Avenue all the way to Highway 427, where it would then travel south and follow Highway 409 to Pearson International Airport. The route would then dive south to Eglinton Avenue and run along Eglinton to Highway 403. The route would then head south and then west along Upper Middle Street to Trafalgar Road, where it would then run south to Oakville Station. All four of these alignments would be dropped for various reasons, although the main one would be construction complexities, as many of them would require extensive use of elevated structures over roads like Sheppard, Finch, and Eglinton. The preferred alignment for the Northern Line would be one which utilized the various hydro corridors around Toronto to minimize the need for extensive grade separations, such as elevated and underground structures. Like the other proposals, this route would have started at Pickering Station and then likely followed the CN York subdivision around the Rouge Valley to the Finch Avenue Hydro Corridor. From there, the line would follow the Finch Hydro Corridor, the Humber-Pearson Hydro Corridor, and the Central Mississauga Corridor to Highway 403. There, the route would then follow the highway to Oakville Station. As stated earlier, the stations for the ALRT network would be 2 to 3 kilometers apart, and while it's impossible to know what the final station list would have been, I will attempt to name the most likely ones. After leaving Pickering Station, the likely stops along the Northern Line, assuming a 2 to 3 kilometer stop spacing, may have been Whites Road, Markham Road, McCowan Road, Kennedy Road, Victoria Park Avenue, Leslie Street, Bayview Avenue, Yonge Street, Bathurst Street, Dufferin Street, Keele Street, Jane Street, Finch Avenue West and Weston Road, Islington Avenue, Kipling Avenue, Dixon Road, Eglinton Avenue West, Centennial Parkway, Dixie Road, Cawthra Road, Hurontario Street, Mavis Road, Credit View Road, Erin Mills Parkway, Winston Churchill Boulevard, Burnhamthorpe Road, Dundas Street, Upper Middle Road, 8th Line, Oakville GO Station. It is possible that infill stations would have been built along the route as the areas around the line developed. I will say that I have seen conflicting maps for the Northern Line, as some put it to the north of the Mississauga City Centre in the Hydro Corridor, while others put it to the south on Burnhamthorpe Road. While this doesn't affect the proposed stations, as all the same streets are intersected, it does change how the route would be built through Mississauga. The Hydro Corridor alignment would need to be built at grade due to the overhead power lines, while the Burnhamthorpe alignment would need to be elevated or tunneled due to the street. The Hydro Corridor alignments weren't without their own complications, since the route would be running through and alongside active power lines. A report on the topic would look at examples from around the world, including Queensland Rail in Australia, Dutch Railways, and British Rail. In the latter case, the report noted a section of British Rail that parallels a 275 kilovolt high voltage line for 160 kilometers between Carlisle and Motherwell. The presence of the high voltage power lines introduced some unknowns, as planners and engineers didn't really know how the electric fields would affect riders, the trains, and the general environment. In a report on the project, it was noted that potential problems could be grounding, bonding, electromagnetic interference, and the effects on pipelines due to electromagnetic induction. These questions were ultimately never answered due to the project's cancellation. A branch line to the airport was also proposed as part of the Northern Line, although I don't know if it would have followed Dixon Road or Highway 409 to the airport. I also don't know if this branch would have just been a straight shot to Pearson or if there would be mid-block stations on it. If so, then Carlingview Drive would likely be the one and only mid-block station on this branch. I also can't say for certain where the yard or yards for this line may have been. That said, back in the 1980s, areas like northeastern Scarborough were still very underdeveloped, and so it is likely that the yard or yards would have been built in places like northeastern Scarborough or northern Oakville, which is still quite rural today. In regards to this proposal, both Metro Toronto and York Region took an interest in it. In the case of Metro Toronto, they were in the process of conducting the Accelerated Rapid Transit Study, which was examining various corridors around Toronto which could be quickly converted for higher order transit use. Relevant to this chapter, Metro Toronto was also looking at the possibility of building its own rapid transit lines on the Sheppard and Finch corridors. The proposed Etobicoke RT, for example, was planned to use the Humber-Pearson and Finch Hydro corridors, the same ones the ALRT Northern Line would use. The Minister of Transportation made it clear that the province would cooperate with Metro Toronto on this and other areas where ALRT may conflict with Metro's own plans. The ideal solution was for the routes like the Etobicoke RT to use ALRT cars. This would make the route compatible with the GO ALRT Northern Line and allow both GO ALRT and the TTC Etobicoke RT cars to share the same right-of-way and interline service. Metro Toronto's position on the matter at the time, however, was to pursue the most appropriate transit mode for the corridor. Metro Toronto's preferred solution in the case of the Etobicoke RT was streetcars operating as an LRT, which would have been incompatible with the ALRT, necessitating the need for a completely separate right-of-way. As an aside, I think that had push come to shove, the Etobicoke RT would have likely used ALRT trains in the end, since the province was going to build the right-of-way and was willing to let the TTC use it. Naturally, this would have saved Metro Toronto money. York Region, as mentioned before, also took an interest in the Northern Line, as at the time the majority of the region's development was on its very southern border along Steeles Avenue. In a 1983 report, the York Region Technical Advisory Committee would note that approximately 39,000 residents of the region's southern urbanized area commuted into Toronto for work, and of them approximately 38% worked north of Highway 401. At the same time, approximately 38,000 residents of Metro Toronto commuted into York Region for work, and of them, approximately 52% lived north of Highway 401. Both of these figures were expected to grow to 100,000 people commuting both ways by 2011. With this in mind, York Region supported and believed the Northern Line to be a necessity, as it would help disperse commuters traveling in both directions among the urban growth areas of North York, Scarborough, and York. To achieve this, York Region recommended stations be at least 2 kilometers apart and feature ample terminal facilities for buses as well as parking and pickup areas. They also preferred that the line stay along Finch up to Highway 27. The Finch Hydro Corridor ends at Weston Road, meaning everything west of it would have to be elevated above Finch Avenue. Lastly, York Region opposed the ALRT alignment along Eglinton Avenue as it would put the route too far south, thus making it completely useless to commuters going to and from York Region. By this point as well, the Finch Hydro Corridor was the preferred alignment by the province, and Eglinton would be seen as a major deviance from this plan, even if it was the preferred route by the cities of York, Etobicoke, and Mississauga. While there were still some details left to be sorted out, by the time the ALRT project was shelved, the Northern Line had solidified as a crosstown route across the northern part of Toronto, operating from Pickering in the east to Oakville in the west. Utilizing hydro corridors, the line would have helped disperse commuters coming from York Region to the growing areas of Scarborough and North York. With ample connections to local public transit, it would have also increased the intra-regional travel and given commuters a way not only around their own region but around the Greater Toronto Area without having to travel through downtown Toronto. The Northern Line, however, was not the only route proposed. While it was by far the one that had the best chance of being built, there was also a proposed Southern Line, so let's look at that one next. The Southern Line was the other route proposed for the GO ALRT project. However, it was a lower priority due to both its construction complexity as well as the Lakeshore GO line already operating on the corridor. The Southern Line would have been built in two phases, with the first phase being two short lines from Oakville to Hamilton and Pickering to Oshawa. For the line in the east to Oshawa, the plan was for the route to operate on a new right-of-way on the south side of Highway 401 following the CN Rail Kingston subdivision. After Pickering Station, the line would travel east on its own right-of-way, making additional stops at Westney Road, Ajax, and Brock Street, Whitby. After Whitby, the line would have run across Highway 401 to a stop at Hopkins Street. From there, the route would have continued northeast and followed the CP Belleville subdivision on its own right-of-way on the south side of the tracks to a stop at Stevenson Road, Oshawa. Finally, the route would continue to follow the Belleville subdivision to its eastern terminus at Bloor Street East. Multiple locations were proposed for the yard. These include a site at Kellano Street and Church Street, a site on the northeast corner of Brock Road and Highway 401, and a site on Bailey Street west of Brock Road. Ultimately though, the preferred yard location was to be on land around what is today Stellar Drive and Thorton Road in Oshawa. The branch line out west between Oakville and Hamilton was also fairly simple, until it wasn't. From Oakville, the line would have run on its own right-of-way following the north side of the CN Oakville subdivision. Stations would have been located at 4th Line, 3rd Line, Bronte, Appleby Line, Appleby, Brant Street, Burlington, and Waterdown Road, Aldershot. The preferred yard location for this line was around 4th Line and South Service Road West. This is also where this route stops being simple, as there was a lot of discussion about the route's alignment into Hamilton and multiple alignments were proposed. The first hurdle was just getting the line into Hamilton since it would need to cross the Burlington Bay. Two alignments were proposed, one of which was quickly rejected, that being following the Queen Elizabeth Expressway, which was rejected as a dedicated bridge would need to be constructed over the Burlington Bay Canal, which would add considerable cost to the project. As well, this alignment would bring the line to the far eastern side of Hamilton, well away from its downtown core. The preferred option, and really the only option, was to continue following the CN Oakville subdivision into Hamilton, although this too wasn't without multiple alignments being looked at. Once in Hamilton, the problems didn't stop, as now it needed to be decided where exactly the line would end and what alignment it would take to get there, and oh boy were there a lot of alignments proposed, 14 to be exact. The first looked at was to follow the current CP Lakeshore West subdivision to the train station at Hunter Street, today's Hamilton Station. This alignment was quickly rejected due to space constraints along the line and through the Hunter Street Tunnel. This would either require ALRT to operate on CP Rail's tracks, which would defeat the point of ALRT, or some other structure would need to be built, either a tunnel below the current Hunter Street Tunnel or an elevated structure above the CP Rail tracks and Hunter Street. Both of these options were considered impractical. Option 2 proposed to run along the north side of the CN Oakville subdivision to the old CN Rail station at James Street, immediately east of today's West Harbour GO station. New platforms would need to be built since ALRT would be on its own right-of-way, although the old station house could still be utilized for ticketing and waiting areas. Only a pedestrian bridge to the new platforms would need to be constructed. Option 3 would be much the same as the last, although instead of stopping at the old CN rail station, the route would turn south and run down John Street on an elevated structure to an elevated station on the south side of Wilson Avenue. Option 4 was much the same as the last two, although this one would bypass the old CN rail station and continue to Ferguson Avenue, where it would then run south on an elevated structure and then cut through Beasley Park to Wilson Avenue. From there, the line would continue elevated along the south side of Wilson Avenue to an elevated station at James Street. Option 5 would have been the same as option 4, only this time the line would run along Ferguson Avenue to King William Street. There it would head west to an elevated station at Catherine Street. Option 6 would have been like option 4, although this time, after cutting through Beasley Park, the route would have continued on an elevated structure along Catherine Street to a station at Main Street. Option 7 again would be like the last ones, although here the line would remain on Ferguson Avenue to an elevated station at Main Street. Option 8 would have the route run alongside Highway 403 to Main Street, where it would then dive underground and run to an underground station at James Street. Option 9 would also run alongside Highway 403, although this time it would break off south of Main Street and dive underground, following the CP rail lines to an underground station to James Street, below the current Hamilton station. Option 10 would run alongside the CN rail tracks to Harvey Park, where the line would then break off and move onto an elevated structure down the middle of York Boulevard to an elevated station at James Street and Wilson Avenue. Option 11 would be the same as option 10, with the difference being the route would turn south at Bay Street and run to an elevated station at King Street. Option 12 would run along Highway 403 before diving underground to pass under Hamilton Cemetery and Woodbine Crescent. The route would then transition onto an elevated structure down the middle of York Boulevard to an elevated station at James Street and Wilson Avenue. Option 13 would be the same as option 12, although this time the route would remain under York Boulevard instead of elevated and run to an underground station at Park Street. The final option would once again be the same as the last, although here the line would turn south at Bay Street to an underground station at King Street. When you look at maps for GO ALRT, you will usually see them show a loop through Hamilton, but the truth is, even if it wasn't officially announced, the elevated alignment along York Boulevard was the preferred alignment in Hamilton. This can be seen by both the number of drawings made for this alignment, as well as the fact that the province was already eyeing the possibility of a further extension of the line to Niagara Falls. For this extension, the most preliminary alignment was for the route to cut through Beasley Park and run north along Ferguson Avenue to the CN rail tracks, where it would then transition back to grade and on its own right of way and continue east to Niagara Falls. For this extension, only Kenilworth Avenue is directly stated as a possible stop location, but it is safe to assume that had this extension actually gotten out of the preliminary phase, then stops in Stony Creek, Grimsby, St. Catharines, Meryton, and Niagara Falls would have also been included as well. Lastly, the province also very briefly looked at a southern extension of the route from Hamilton, but this was quickly ruled out due to geographic complications caused by Hamilton Mountain. As well, it was noted that even if this extension could be built, its service would be very limited compared to the rest of the network. Now, with all of that out of the way, we can finally get on to Phase 2 of the Southern Line. We have these two lines at each end of the Greater Toronto Area, and now it's time to link them together. Phase 2 won't take as much time to explain as it's much simpler, on paper at least. For Phase 2, the two branches of the Southern Line would be unified by a conversion of the existing Lakeshore GO service to ALRT. The tracks for this part of the Southern Line would be built alongside the pre-existing CN rail tracks, except in restricted areas where property would have to be purchased or leased from CN Rail for a separate elevated structure. In a study done by Delcan, it was noted that there would be no point in constructing joint use facilities between ALRT and pre-existing GO service. as GO ALRT would have the capacity to completely replace the pre-existing commuter rail service. What this means in practical terms is every station along the pre-existing GO Lakeshore East and West lines would be converted to ALRT standards, for example high-level platforms, and service on the Lakeshore GO lines as we know it would be ended and replaced with ALRT. Obviously, this is easier said than done since none of the stations on the Lakeshore lines were designed for ALRT, and so new platforms would need to be built, old ones converted to high-level boarding, and others removed to fit the new ALRT right-of-way. Pretty much a complete top-to-bottom rebuild of the Lakeshore lines, even more dramatic than the current one planned as part of the RER project, since ALRT would have a completely separate right-of-way to contend with. It is no wonder this part of the ALRT project was the last to be done since it is arguably the most complex. The Delcan study noted that at least 50% of the route would have to be elevated to avoid level crossings and maintain a 70 km/h average speed. The Union Station corridor is an example of the complications the route alignment would have to overcome. Where would the platforms be? Would they be elevated in a similar manner to this drawing? Would they be underground like the subway platforms? Or would they be at grade with two of Union Station's pre-existing platforms converted to ALRT standards? These are the types of questions that needed to be answered about the Southern Line. The alignment already existed, it was just a matter of how it would be built. Metro Toronto also had an interest in this part of the Southern Line, as at the time they were examining the use of the Lakeshore Rail Corridor for their own downtown Relief Line subway. Like with the Northern Line, the province urged the two parties to cooperate, with the possible outcome being both GO Transit and the TTC utilizing the ALRT corridor from Jones Avenue to Union Station. This of course would necessitate the Relief Line used ALRT trains like the Etobicoke RT would for its shared right-of-way with the Northern Line. Finally, I am unsure about the stations on this section of the route, as while ALRT is stated to have a 2 to 3 km stop spacing, it seems on the Southern Line stop spacing is more in line with commuter rail than rapid transit compared to the Northern Line. Outside of Toronto, the stop spacing is quite large, and I am unsure if this would remain true within Toronto or if more infill stations would have been constructed. It is projected that this section of the Southern Line from Pickering to Oakville alone would cost $1.1 billion in 1983, which is about $3.05 billion today in 2024. Essentially, half of the project's entire budget would be spent on just the Lakeshore corridor between Pickering and Oakville alone. Before I get into what brought down the ALRT plan, there are a couple of house cleaning items I want to get out of the way. Looking at this map, you can see the province had also considered other ALRT lines beyond the Northern and Southern lines. Whether or not any of these would have gotten off the ground though is anyone's guess. As well, it seems these plans overlapped with other local proposals, as if the province was saying, if you won't build it, then we will, using our own trains. Of these proposals we can see a branch line from the Northern Line to the Scarborough Town Centre using a now long abandoned Canadian Northern Rail corridor passing through the Malvern area. The TTC was also looking at this very same corridor for its Scarborough RT line. Another crosstown line along Shepherd Avenue, with this one leaving Pickering and following Ellesmere Road to the Scarborough Town Centre. There, it would run north to Shepherd Avenue and follow Shepherd to the Humber-Pearson Hydro Corridor, where it would link up with the Northern Line. The TTC was also looking at Shepherd Avenue as a possible rapid transit corridor. A north-south route was looked at connecting Brampton to the ALRT network, with this route breaking off from the Northern Line at Highway 403 and following it and Highway 410 into Brampton. Lastly, two final branch lines were proposed in Mississauga to connect the Northern and Southern lines. One line would run down here Ontario Street, while the other would run down Erin Mills Parkway. Peel Region at the time was examining both of these corridors for their own possible rapid transit lines. Yes, that does mean that Peel Region was examining the construction of a rapid transit network in the region back in the 80s. It just took them about 40 years to finally get around to it. Now, with all of that out of the way, we can finally discuss what brought the ALRT project to an end. By the time it all came to an end, the project was far enough along that the province had begun buying up some of the right-of-way. In fact, the entire right-of-way between Pickering and Oshawa had been purchased and is today the only part of the ALRT network actually built, with it being used by the Lakeshore East Line. So what killed GO ALRT? Well, like pretty much every other unbuilt transit project from this era, it was the retirement of Premier Bill Davis. ALRT was his grand vision for faster regional transit in the Greater Toronto Area, and it seems he was the only one in Queen's Park with an appetite for it and its multi-billion-dollar cost. Once he retired, the plan quickly fell apart, although there were other factors that helped contribute to its demise. The ICTS trains by the mid-80s had become a bit of an ugly duckling due to the issues on the Scarborough RT, even though this ignores the fundamental differences between the RT trains and the ALRT trains. The federal government had also passed a law requiring freight companies to give priority to passenger rail. And of course, price was always an issue as well. But ultimately, the final blow for the project would come with the election of the Liberals in 1985. The Liberals were not keen on spending billions of dollars for grand projects like GO ALRT or Network 2011, a story for another time, and instead they looked for alternatives. The new Minister of Transportation, Ed Thorton, had ordered a feasibility study on the expansion of GO service to Hamilton using the pre-existing GO trains. His reasoning was that since the new bi-level cars had been developed in 1978 by Ontario-based hawker Sidley, they would give more bang for our buck. He did not want the bi-levels pushed aside in favor of the unproven ALRT trains after only 10 years of service. Basically, we had the bi-levels and they were still practically brand new, so we'll keep using them. So the final nail in the coffin for GO ALRT would be from the Liberals deciding it would be cheaper to use what we currently have than build something entirely new. And with that, the ALRT project was dead. In the aftermath of ALRT's cancellation, the GO train network would continue to grow in a piecemeal fashion with new stations and lines opening here and there. The province would over time purchase more and more of the trackage that GO trains run on, thus giving the province more control over the network, but there is still much to do to bring us closer to the future that ALRT painted for us. GO ALRT is quite possibly the greatest what if in regards to public transit in and around Toronto. It was a grand vision to create a larger inter-regional rapid transit network bringing fast and reliable transit to the Greater Toronto Area, linking Hamilton, Mississauga, Toronto, and Oshawa together to make commuting between them and within them faster and easier. It was a plan that showed the province wasn't just thinking about today, but also about tomorrow and what will be the transit needs of the region 30 years from now. It was the type of long-term vision and thinking that you just don't see anymore. GO ALRT wasn't just being built for the commuters of the time, but also the commuters of the future as the Greater Toronto Area grew. It's hard to imagine what the Greater Toronto Area would look like today had it been built and how commuting patterns would have changed. It is also interesting to wonder if the ALRT network would have been further expanded. Remember, the point of ALRT was for the province to have control over all aspects of the system and not have to deal with the freight rail operators. While the province and its transit operator Metrolinx now own the majority of the GO train network, there are still parts of the network that Metrolinx doesn't own, a big one being the Milton line. In a world where GO ALRT is constructed, could we have seen an ALRT line built along the Milton corridor to get around CP Rail's ownership of the line? Maybe we construct an ALRT line along the Midtown corridor. What other corridors could become ALRT lines? If anything, ALRT showed the province was willing to go its own way and build its own lines instead of having to rely on what already existed. Instead of relying on freight companies to play ball, we can just build our own lines and not have to deal with CN or CP rails. It's no secret that the freight companies are no friends of passenger rail, especially CP, and so any opportunity we get to not have to deal with them is an opportunity worth taking. What would the trains look like? The original ALRT trains were a variant of the ICTS Mark I trains, so today would we see a Mark V variant that uses overhead catenary and standard traction motors? Or would the network now use trains similar to the ones used on Montreal's REM? How about the Ontario line in Toronto? It will use automated trains powered by overhead catenary, so it would have absolutely used the ALRT Southern line between Pape and the Don River and then join up again at Exhibition. Today, the province of Ontario is investing billions of dollars to electrify our GO network as part of its RER project, and it's hard not to think that we could have already had this 40 years ago. I'm not saying RER is a bad thing, it's not. It's something that the region needs, it's just we could have done this 4 decades ago and should have. Nothing gets cheaper as time moves on, and what would have cost maybe $4 or $5 billion in the 80s will cost nearly $20 billion today. When you look at it like that, it's hard not to be a little upset and a little angry. Would ALRT have lived up to the expectations of one train every 2 minutes during rush hour? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what is certain is that ALRT would have been better than any GO service we had back then and any GO service we have today by sheer virtue of the lines being electrified and service being far more frequent every day of the week, even if it's not every 2 minutes during rush hour. Even one train every 5 minutes or 10 minutes during rush hour would be an improvement over what we have today. Before I end this video, I will leave you with this quote from Bill Davis's Minister of Transportation, James Snow, from his autobiography. I believe my biggest disappointment over my years in government took place within weeks of my leaving the Minister's office in the Ministry of Transportation and Communications. This was the total scrapping of all plans for the new GO Transit Advanced Light Rail System. This happened as soon as Bill Davis and I were away from the cabinet table. I am sure it was a decision of the new minister, George McCoe, and the treasurer, Larry Grossman, but Frank Miller surely must have been in on the discussion and this major decision. To me, this will prove to have been the most devastating decision ever taken by a government in recent times to the people of the greater metro region of Ontario. The plan was a good, well thought out addition to the Ontario transportation system that will someday have to be built, or Metro will completely strangle and choke in traffic jams as it is already doing today. I know the cost was high, but it will never be lower. The plan could have been implemented in stages over perhaps 20 years, as I had planned to do as funds were available. The plan included a direct ALRT link to Toronto International Airport from the total area between Oshawa and Hamilton, where a population of nearly 5 million people already reside. We all know how badly that it is needed today. The most disgusting thing is that there was not even any action taken to protect the right-of-ways for future building of these lines. You can possibly understand Grossman wanting to cancel GO ALRT, as it did not do anything for his St. Andrew-St. Patrick riding, but it is hard to believe that Miller and McCoe could not have seen the light at the end of the tunnel. This decision will cost us dearly in the future. Already, portions of the plan are being built at a greatly increased cost on a piecemeal basis. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about GO ALRT, don't be afraid to do so in the comment section down below. I know you've all been waiting quite a while for this video, and it took me a while to put this one together, including learning how to animate in Blender, and I even recreated the GO Transit font for this video, so I hope you all enjoyed it. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.